whatever. All right, everyone, we're going to get started. All right, so everyone, I'm Zachary Fink, ZBF Geothermal, also the Vice President of NY-GEO. We're going to be talking today about the eligibility for the federal investment tax credits. So these are the commercial Section 48 tax credits that are still in effect. And this is something that I personally spend a lot of time on, that this is kind of the reason that geothermal jobs can end up being economically viable. And one of the things that I want to toss out as you listen to these presentations and we go through kind of all of the different facets of eligibility and step-up bonuses and selling a tax credit and cost segregation and all of these things involved is that it's very tough to get the maximum incentives if you're not thinking about incentives throughout the entire process. That if you, and we've done projects where it's the end of the project, you go out, you get a cost segregation study, you go sell your tax credit, but you're not maximizing the value of the tax credit unless you're starting on day one saying, you know, what equipment are we using, what's in basis, how are we formatting our AIAs, and really setting up the project for success that way. So 4 separate panelists representing kind of the different sides of, you know, cost segregation and, you know, the different pieces you need to put together the tax credits. So we're going to start with Ravi, and I'll let each of them introduce themselves as we go down the line and give a little bit about their experience as well. And everyone's going to take a slightly different topic, but they all are kind of experts in each of these topics as well, which will make the panel discussion that much more interesting.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ravi. I am a manager on the I-Bailey team for energy incentives, and excited to talk about a little bit how these work today. So I'll give a quick overview about how kind of the credit is calculated. It has 2 major components. Eligible cost basis is more or less how you've determined your energy system or your geothermal system has costs in the eyes of the IRS. And then you multiply that basis by whatever your eligible credit percentage is, which has a couple of different components. So everybody starts at 6%. If you meet domestic content requirements or energy community requirements, they're 2% each. Now, one of the more important things that we'll get to later is the prevailing wage and apprenticeship rules or one of the safe harbors. That is a 5 times multiplier. So your base credit jumps to 30% if those rules are met, domestic content to 10%, and energy community to 10% as well. So for a lot of these projects, the ceiling is 50%. A lot of them fall between 30 and 50%. One of the main kind of bonuses that takes a little extra work to achieve is the domestic content bonus. So one of the first components of that is structural steel and iron. 100% of your structural steel and iron on a project does have to be sourced from the United States. Within geothermal, I don't see a ton of structural steel and iron, but it's something that can come up. So definitely something to keep in mind moving forward. The bigger piece that you're going to see on geothermal projects is your manufactured products requirement. So this is basically the percentage by cost of your manufactured components that's produced in the U.S. And this percentage that's required does change based on beginning of construction. So for projects that started this year, you're looking at a 50% requirement. If it started earlier, maybe 45 or 40% as well. So it is one thing to meet the requirements, it's a whole other thing to document them, and that's where a lot of the planning comes in. So there's a few different ways to go about this. Essentially, you need to document your cost or your direct cost associated with the materials and equipment used on the project, and then you need to document where the material is sourced from. One of the most effective ways that we've seen to do that is working with vendors to get letters with model numbers, kind of speaking to the components that they sold, where was it manufactured, where was it, and how much of it was produced in the United States. Getting a bill of materials and where things were sold would work as well. There's a few different ways that you can go about doing that, but you do need to document basically those 2 items for each of the components throughout the project. Now, just to clarify, that 40 or 50, whatever the percentage ended up being, is across all of your manufactured components as a whole. So if one product ends up being at 0% or 15%, let's say, some of the heat pumps were not sourced here, that's okay, as long as across your ductwork, your piping, all of your qualified components across the whole project, you average out to higher than whatever that required percentage was. The reason why this is important for eligibility is for larger projects claiming elective pay. So if you're over that 1 megawatt threshold, domestic content moving forward, or for projects that started this year, is essentially a requirement. There's a phase-out percentage associated with not meeting the domestic content requirements, and for projects that started in 2026, you're able to claim 0% of the credit. Now, this is for geothermal projects over 1 megawatt claiming through the elective pay. So not in the for-profit space or not for your under 1 megawatt projects, but it is something to keep in mind for your larger scale geo in the public space. For projects that started in 25 and 24, there's still impact, but there's credit available. So it's become a much bigger point of concern this year and moving forward. So just to kind of summarize, the key here is documentation. I'm sure you're going to hear this from a lot of folks on the panel today. This is not something you want to be assessing at the end of your project. We find a lot of success when in the bid phase, in the contract requirements for the project, everybody knows they need to meet these domestic content requirements. They need to work with whatever third-party groups are assessing these, and it's just a part of the project from the beginning. We've had plenty of projects meet these thresholds. When we come in at the end, even when folks were attempting to meet it, there's just a lot of places to footfall, a lot of places where you might not have the documentation. And so getting out in front of it is maybe the biggest key to success, and getting all of the parties in the same room from the beginning.
Yeah, and we see that it's easiest to ask for the information as part of submittals up front. So when the contractor submits the project, if they can't get the domestic content letter or certification information they need at that point, when the manufacturer rep, the entire ecosystem wants the sale, you're not getting it later. So from my perspective, we always ask for it to be part of these submittals, and if not, we tend to reject the product.
Hey everybody, I'm Josh Howes with Walker Blue. I'm the CEO. We do much of what these guys up here do. We focus on the ITC and help you guys get the full maximum amount of ITC that you're eligible for, and help you document it and do all those things. So today I'm basically going to focus on prevailing wage and apprenticeship. It's not overly complicated, but much like you're going to hear from everybody else up here, you really do have to address this before you start your project. Even if your project is a prevailing wage project, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to pay the correct prevailing wages. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to pay, that you're going to have apprentices on the job by the right, amount of percentages and things of that nature. So a lot of this stuff has to be done before you even write your specs for the project, before they even go out to bid, because your contractors are going to need to know what their expectations are, and they're going to have to bid it right. So if you've already bid the project out and then all of a sudden you start dealing with ITC, you're going to be dealing with change orders. You're going to be trying to make up, your shortfalls in labor where you fell short with apprentices, or maybe you underpaid people because you didn't pay them the right prevailing wage. So this is definitely one of them that you want to address really during the planning phase of the project. So, this is also, if you're over a megawatt, this is the one that gets you the 5-time multiplier, right? So it could be argued this is the most important thing on the project if you're over a megawatt, because it takes you from 6% to 30, or 8% to 40, or 10% to 50. So the basic rules around it are on the prevailing wage side. Most people understand prevailing wage, but however, it's the Department of Labor federal prevailing wage is the one that we're worried about. So there's a lot of state contracts out there where you have maybe a state job, then you're paying attention to the state prevailing wage rates that have been published. Those aren't necessarily the same as the federal, and the federal is the one that matters. And we've seen a lot of projects where we get handed all of the wage reports at the end of the project, and they're 96 cents an hour short of paying them the right amount because they paid them the state rate and not the federal rate. So that matters. So prevailing wage, like I said, it is what it is. Based on the job classification, you're going to pay each worker that's on the project the federal prevailing wage that's posted at the time of contract for the county that you're working in, right? So those are easy to find on sam.gov. You can just go and look up your project and pull down the right wage rate. Apprenticeship is a little bit more complicated. So apprenticeship, I didn't put the chart up here, but it's kind of like the domestic content. There was a phase-in. We're pretty well out of the phase-in. I think 2022 and prior was 10%, and then in 23 it bumped to 12.5%. So for the last few years, we've been under a 15% apprenticeship requirement. So what that means is that 15% of your labor hours on the project have to be performed by a registered apprentice. So your contractors are going to have a registered program. It can be registered in the state level. It can be registered at the federal level, but it's going to be an approved apprenticeship program, and then those workers are going to get registered into it. And you should get certificates back for those workers as you register them into the program to show that the states accepted them into the program, and we keep all those things on file. But 15% is your registered apprentice labor hours across basically across the the geothermal portion of the project, because that's all we're worried about. We're not worried about other things that are happening. So for the costs that we're counting into your cost basis, we're going to monitor those labor hours. The second piece to the apprenticeship requirement is that you're going to pay them the right wage rate, right? So that apprenticeship program that's been registered will also publish what the wage rates are for those apprentices based on maybe how far along the program they are. They might get different rates of pay. The third thing is that we're going to pay attention to the journeyman to apprenticeship ratio that's in that registered apprenticeship program. So it might be a 1-to-1 ratio, it might be a 3-to-2 ratio, it might be 1-to-5. I mean, it varies across the board. So there's no set rate except for that a contractor's registered apprenticeship program rate. So we're going to pay attention to that as well. And then the last piece of it that a lot of people miss is that if you have, it's the 4 or more worker rule, right? So a contractor is considered exempt from the apprenticeship requirements if they only employ 3 or fewer workers on the job. Once they put that 4th worker on the job, they're now required to put an apprentice on the job. It doesn't, if that contractor only puts 3 workers on the job, they're exempt. They're not required to put an apprentice on the job, but it doesn't alleviate their hours from the 15% requirement. So you still have the overall 15% that you got to meet, but that particular contractor would not be required to put an apprentice on the job. So super simple, right? Penalties, you can cure these things. If you get to the end of the project and you paid the guy 96 cents an hour too short, you can cure these things. They can get relatively expensive. Prevailing wage cures require interest plus back pay to the employee plus $5,000 per violation to the IRS. That can be escalated to $10,000 if the IRS decides that it was willful and intentional disregard of the law. So that can get expensive. And the apprenticeship hour violations are $50 an hour if it's cured ahead of time. So like if you figured you were 100 man hours short of meeting your 15%, you can pay the IRS $50 times 100 and cure that. If the IRS decides that it was willful, intentional disregard, that can be $500 an hour. So that can also get expensive. So you want to pay attention to this stuff early. You're going to hear it over and over again. But that's kind of the nuts and bolts of PWA. And you definitely want to have somebody, tracking this thing throughout the whole project, because these things can get away from you quick, and you don't want to be paying $5,000, $10,000 per violation, things of that nature. So, yep, that's it.
Morning, everyone. The font looked better placed last time I saw it, but I think maybe. Yeah. That's no. I'll take it. I'll own that. So, hey everyone. I'm Dorian Hunt, partner, head of energy tax at Leo Barrick. We are an energy and infrastructure focused advisory firm. We operate in tax, financial due diligence, integration and separation. Pretty much, we are a one-stop shop for everything transaction-oriented to do with projects in the energy and infrastructure space. As far as supporting tax incentives goes, we advise sponsor developers, IPPs, tax equity investors. We act as tax insurance underwriting counsel, and we have a valuation and cost segregation practice in support of cost breakouts like Ravi was alluding to. And also we advise on prevailing wage and apprenticeship as well, in however it may be needed. So again, I head up energy tax. So I've been doing credit determination and monetization for energy projects for over 20 years. So a lot of tax equity is what that means for things like wind and solar, going way back. And then, of course, with the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act and transferability, that kind of opened up the opportunities for credit monetization beyond what was available for under traditional tax equity structures. So we've seen a real explosion of opportunity in terms of credit monetization, but also an explosion of associated complexity, right, and paths and decision analytics to apply. So that's me. My PR people ran my picture through AI, and it somehow just made my forehead even bigger. Which thank you for that, AI. Let's keep pumping all the juice we make into it. So first of all, I want to mention FEOC, foreign entity of concern stuff. So, and I only want to mention it just because in the tax credit space, folks, talk about foreign entity of concern limitations. It's a new thing with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and for lots of technologies under certain credits, it can really stifle development and slow the inflow of capital due to uncertainty and just kind of obvious risks around having components in your project from foreign sources or foreign entities of concern, to be more specific. And if we're in the world of geothermal heat pumps, under Code Section 48, Internal Revenue Code Section 48, we don't need to worry about all that, right? So, and we have a nice long runway where we're still under Section 48. But I do want to mention that if there's any projects that are trying to qualify under 48E for things like a geothermal, electric, and flash and power and stuff like that, then there's a lot to navigate around FEOC, among other things. So happy to talk about that in a smaller group if anyone's interested. But now maybe another bit of good news for geothermal under 48 is that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act took away what they call the limited use requirements for the ownership of a geothermal unit of property. So a little background, the Section 48 final regulations that came out at the end of December 2023, codified and kind of made clear that the Treasury's view is that in order to claim an energy credit on a piece of property, it had to be a unit of energy property, which is a functionally interdependent chain of equipment, right, that operates for a given purpose. So think about ground loop to heat pump or whatever, right? Some sort of chain of equipment. Now, they're in common kind of business models. It was frequently the case that you would maybe lease heat pumps to users, right, or enter into some sort of service contract, and the premise would be that you retain ownership, right, of the project and maybe generate credits and monetize them, do what you will. But it was often a difficult, a steep climb to say that you were the owner of the ground loops, right, because those, even though they're under a leasing arrangement, it was often a difficult argument to say you could lift those up and repurpose them, right, for some other use, right, which is a crucial aspect of the tax leasing rules. So One Big Beautiful Bill Act kind of dropped this surprise, a nice surprise that said, hey, okay, for this asset class, you're not worried about this limited use test anymore. So the question of tax ownership in a lot of typical business models. Just it became a lot more clear, a lot easier to navigate, and I think it opens up a lot of opportunities. So again, that one is concerned with some relief around the concept of tax ownership, which is crucial to credits. Now, I also want to talk about transferability just a bit. So I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act gave us Code Section 6418, which allows for the sale of certain credits. So it used to be the case that you would have to do something, if you wanted to monetize tax incentives, you had to put together something like a partnership joint venture and make special allocations of tax attributes in exchange for cash. And it's a complicated structure that usually required projects to be pretty big to support all the transaction costs that go into structuring those things. But transferability comes in and it lets us just sell credits. So place project in service with a tax owner, we generate a credit. We don't have the tax liability to use it directly because let's say we're in a net operating loss carry forward position, but we want to, we don't want to lose out on that value because it makes the deal pencil out in a lot of cases. So we have that credit and we can sell it on the market. So there's a market for tradable credits. You can only sell them once, only sell them for cash, and you need to sell them to an unrelated party in a time period that begins at the start of the year in which the system was placed into service and ends at the extended tax filing deadline for that year. So think about, if it were this year, right, January, and you're a calendar year taxpayer, January 1, 26 to say October 27, right? It's a pretty wide window in which you can sell the credits. Now, the ability to transfer credits, it's different than what Ravi was alluding to with 6417 direct pay. That's a program whereby you can seek out direct payment from the government for these incentives, but only for this asset class when you're tax exempt, an applicable entity, and that's where those domestic content kind of throttling rules come in on the direct pay. I'm talking about something totally different, which is, well, not totally different, but it's the sale of the credits. Now, maybe an interesting complexity that comes up, an opportunity, is even if you're selling these credits under the transferability regime, you can still put them in some sort of partnership structure and maybe monetize, take the cash out for the sale of the credits and maybe monetize depreciation as well in a way that you couldn't before, right? So sell off depreciation to an investor that's motivated to reduce his taxable income in exchange for that capital. So, you call these things like hybrid structures or pref equity structures, but there's many ways to be creative in order to maximize the after-tax value of these projects, and transferability is often a really important prong of that. So finally, I'm just going to mention the 80-20 test a little bit. So 80-20 is kind of pervasive across the Internal Revenue Code and the regulations, and it's this premise that, well, first of all, you only get incentives for newly placed in service equipment, but even if a project has some used equipment, you can say it's new if you pass this so-called 80-20 test. So basically, if you have enough CapEx as compared to what they call the fair market value of the retained components, right, the stuff you're keeping in the project, if you pass this ratio, and there's a lot that goes into what it means to capitalize costs and when you should and whatnot, pass this ratio, you can get over that threshold and have something be treated as a new property, even though it could contain some used equipment. So if you're dealing with projects that have kind of legacy pieces to them and you're adding on to them, keep the 80-20 in mind, and it's a rich topic to explore. Thanks.
And for the residential contractors in the room, the 80-20 is a big change from the way that residential contractors operated under 25D, when you could replace the heat pump, leave the ground loop, leave the distribution system, and the customer could take another tax credit on it. The 80-20 rule typically prohibits being able to take a tax credit on just, changing a single unit on a big commercial project, where residentially you could do it before. So just want to make sure everyone's aware of that distinction.
You want to take out your phones and shoot that QR code, and you'll get all my slides plus the slides I'm not presenting today. So take a shot at that QR code. I'm going to be talking about dual use and incremental cost. But before I do that, let's celebrate. We've got 3 years of incentives. Come on, let's hear it. We got 8, 9, 10, 11 more years of incentives. Stand up if you've received an incentive or you helped a customer receive an incentive. Stand up, come on, let's go. That's it? There's gotta be more incentives in the room. Okay, let's celebrate, this is big. We probably secured about $60 million of ground source and another 60 or so million of solar. So these checks are coming in. There's actual checks out there. People are actually getting these funds. It's really important that we celebrate these moments. And with that, I'm going to talk about how I'm taking away tax incentives with dual use and incremental cost. So dual use. Dual use is when there's a valid energy source like ground source and an invalid energy source. And so there's a dual use on equipment that uses both the eligible and the ineligible. There's what's called a 50% cliff. So if the ineligible energy source provides more than 50% on an annual basis, then that dual use equipment that's using both of the energy sources do not qualify at all. They don't qualify for the incentive. So that's dual use. On the other hand, there's incremental cost. That is when a piece of equipment is an ineligible usage. So for ground source, you have to be heating and cooling a structure. You have to be heating and cooling a structure. So if it's not a structure, that's an ineligible usage. And so there's a different calculation for that. That's called incremental cost. So there's dual use where you have a valid energy source and an invalid energy source. And then there's incremental cost where you're either a structure, which is valid, or you're not a structure, and then that's an invalid usage. And so there's different ways to do the calculation. So we're going to go over a lot of the dual use and maybe one example of the incremental cost. So this is the very typical design. We have a ground source system, that's green. You get to take 100% tax credit for that. You get tax credit for everything that's green, you get 100%. Then there's a boiler. Boiler, you get nothing. A gas boiler, you get no tax incentive for the boiler. Where it goes into the loop around the building, that turns blue. It's tainted. It's tainted by the boiler. If the boiler provides more than 50% of the energy, that blue is red. There's no incentive. But if it uses less, then that blue section gets whatever percentage on an annual energy basis is provided by the ground source system. Okay? I skipped over, here we go. Dry cooler, same thing. I'm just replacing the boiler with a dry cooler, same situation. Invalid use, if you're over 50% dry cooler, no incentive for the loop. If you're under that, then you get that percentage of the installed cost for that section. Same thing with cooling tower. Same thing with cooling tower, ineligible use. What about simultaneous heating and cooling? Any thoughts? Well, in IRS's infinite wisdom, they said simultaneous heating and cooling is identical to a gas boiler. So what you need to do is you have to separate your heat pump into a ground source heat pump and a mythical item called simultaneous heating and cooling. The portion of energy coming from simultaneous heating and cooling is ineligible. You have to do a calculation on annual energy. How much of your annual energy is coming from simultaneous heating and cooling? And that has to be extracted out of the loop. So very detrimental. What happened here, maybe the person is in this room, I don't know, but when IRS regulations come out, it's proposed. You then can ask questions or make statements. Somebody asked the unfortunate question, does simultaneous heating and cooling qualify? And IRS took the opportunity to say no when the final regs came out. So now we have to extract simultaneous heating and cooling from your incentive. Another common situation is an air handler. So an air handler, we have our heat pump attached to the air handler. But it also has electric resistance heat. That just tainted the air handler because it has that electric resistance heat. So the heat pump qualifies, but because there's that electric resistance heat, now the air handler has to do that calculation. How much energy is coming from the ground source system, from the heat pump? How much energy on an annual basis is coming from the electric resistance heat? And then everything downstream, all the ductwork downstream from that, then gets tainted. So what do? What you do is you get rid of electric resistance heat if you can, and then all of a sudden everything qualifies. So you get rid of that electric resistance heat and hopefully everything qualifies. Incremental cost. This is not energy use. This is when you are heating an item that is not a structure. So the example I have here is an ice melt system. So The way you calculated this is not the same way you calculate dual use. It is done differently. What you have to do is come up with a simulated cost for a gas boiler. I'm picking gas boiler, but you'd want to choose the least expensive way to melt your ice, for example. So you find the least expensive way to melt your ice, you cost out that mythical system, and then you have to subtract it out of the cost of your system. So that's how you do incremental costs, is when your energy source, your good energy source, ground source, is providing energy to something that doesn't qualify, like an ice melt system, for example, or a process. So that's the incremental cost. Last chance for that QR code, if anybody didn't get the QR code, and then we're going to go to questions. Okay? Thank you.
All right, so with that very quick overview, it's going to take everyone in the room 100 hours to actually come up to speed on all the regulations, and then the IRS will probably issue another determination letter and another notice, and have us all restart. So a few things, and I'm happy that we were able to do the slides relatively quickly, so we can get into questions and some of the more nuancy things. So one of the things, and I'll go to this one first because Jacob just brought it up, on ice storage, domestic hot water, being deemed ineligible. There are some projects, and I'll see if any of you guys have experience with this, where they kind of approach those from thermal storage. So a different section of the tax code, but can you get thermal storage credits to get some of those back into the basis? Any of you want to take that?
So thermal storage, you can get the credit for. It's going to be under the 48E. And so it's going to have those other rules that Dorian was talking about. You're going to deal with the prohibited foreign entities. But depending on how that system is designed, there's and kind of what components are charging. If it's a chiller and a storage tank, you can look at the chiller and the tank costs. There's a lot of different ways that you see the storage system set up. So it's going to depend on what is actually storing that energy and then what is kind of charging or making it possible to store that energy.
And the other thing to toss out is there might be some different design considerations. There's a certain requirement for how much storage capacity you have. So you can't just say, oh, we put this in to shave the 1 hour peak load event, and that allows us to reduce our bore field size. So looking at it up front, which is a theme of this presentation, will be extremely helpful because sometimes it's relatively small incremental costs to get a lot of extra basis into a project. The other thing is, and one of my other big, things we've noticed is that our tax credit basis that we see in a job, that if I took what I would consider my traditional tax credit basis, which is, geothermal boreholes, mechanical system cost, take out any of the air source heat pumps or any of the ineligible items within that, we're typically seeing, basically a 50 to 75% increase in the basis when you actually cost segregate out an entire project. You take percentage of electrical, you take percentage of general conditions, construction loan interest, all of those things. And when you actually look at it, it makes the geothermal equation that much more economically viable from day one. But as a geothermal industry, we tend to only look at the few items that we touch. So wanted to toss that out as well. With that, I think I'll go to questions unless anyone else had a clarification. Chris will walk around with a microphone. If you guys can just say your name and company name first, so it gets captured for the recording.
Good morning, and thank you, panel. Tony Gelba from Pratt with our engineer, Francisco from Legacy. So we're going to start designing a thermal energy network, as I've said 50 times. So my question, we're a not-for-profit. Can we so we have design costs and then we have construction costs. So can we get some of these design costs? This guy is really very efficient and very affordable, but even so, can we get any money back? And then on the construction side, does the contractor, how do I get our money out of the contractor? I mean, do we structure the contract with the contractor so we get it out? I mean, there's like AIA, 14 types of contracts. Do we have the AIA, do we have the IRA AIA contract? Okay, I'll stop. So, design and construction, how does Pratt get the money from the IRA?
Yeah, great question. So I think as it relates to, your question around those design costs, or really kind of any kind of costs that might be attributable to the tax credit eligible basis of the project is going to be driven by the UNICAP rules. So and that's 263A of the code. So you're looking at, you're trying to find a reasonable allocation method for, what they call mixed service costs as part of the organization that aren't directly construction necessarily, but trying to find all that stuff in the organization that you could apply and capitalize onto the basis of those assets that are going to be credit eligible, right? So there's a couple methods that are outlined in the regulations that are based on the hours spent by the various production departments, design of the system or whatever else. But there's also kind of a roll your own technique where you can, depending on your business model and how you operate, you can maybe, try to assemble a reasonable approach. But if you do that, then you need to be sensitive to the fact that you're probably going to have to file a Form 3115 and have a consultation with the IRS so they can approve that your change in accounting method is in their eyes appropriate. And one of the interesting things about this cost capitalization is that's I think relatively unique among tax provisions is that it's driven a lot by how you account for things for GAAP, for your financial reporting purposes, right? So there is some sort of interplay. How you keep your books, right, it does have some influence on how your tax outcomes are determined. Now, with respect to your next question about how do you get the money out, I'm not quite sure I follow, but the typical cadence, right? Engaging somebody to construct the thing, and then you get to mechanical completion or something, and there's a transfer of the asset over. But maybe if you could clarify that point a little bit.
Okay, so, excuse me. Let's say, right now we're thinking that it's going to be a $25 million project, right? And so we hire Aztec Geothermal here because he brought me the mic, 25 million. So if we say this 30% tax credit, that's $7.5 million. So do we get that from Aztec?
Oh, no, okay. So the credit is going to accrue to the entity that owns the asset at the time it's placed into service for tax purposes, which means that the moment that it's ready and available for its intended use. So the typical cadence is, if you have an EPC building it for you, they're going to transfer it over to you for, you're going to take ownership of the thing before it's actually placed in service. So sometime between mechanical and substantial completion, final completion, right? It's closer to substantial completion before it is usually when that place in service event occurs, but it's all facts and circumstances. So the moment the credit accrues to the owner of the asset, and again, ownership is crucial, and that's why I was talking about things like limited use and leases and your third-party ownership model, business model matters a lot. But the credit accrues to you and you're entitled to it, then at that point, you can make a decision as to whether you're going to use it to offset your quarterly tax payments, right, that you might have otherwise payable to the IRS, or you might enter into a transferability arrangement where you want to sell the credit that's generated for some sort of discount, let's say 90 cents on the dollar, 85 cents on the dollar. Market moves, right? It's a negotiated, whatever it is. Or you might want to take even a third path where you sell the credit and also place it into one of these, partnership monetization structures. So you maybe get, in some circumstances, get a little more juice out of it if it's structured right. And I suppose if you're a nonprofit, the other way to get the money is to appeal to the 6417 direct pay program and say and get it that way. But it's crucial you take ownership before it's in service, because if you take ownership after it's in service, within 5 years of it having been placed in service, that's a tax credit clawback recapture event, and it's not good.
And not this panel, but it's, the financing gap that it's going to be the last money that you get back in. So you're going to outlay your $25 million of cost, and in your example, getting the $7.5 million back if your direct pay will happen after placed in service in that calendar year, where you'll file the nonprofit tax return for direct pay and accompany your cost segregation and all the facts to say, what percentage do you end up at?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. So like we deal with a lot of direct pay customers. So you're going to, timeline-wise, you're going to complete the project, then your tax year is going to end at some point, whether fiscal year or calendar year. Then you're going to file your tax return a few months after that, and then you're going to get your check from the IRS a few months after that. So you're going to have to fund the project in its entirety and probably wait a year-ish, a little longer, a little less, before you get your refund back from the IRS. So there's a lot of stuff to deal with when you're getting direct pay, because you're not getting it out of the contractor. He's not going to discount your project $7.5 million. You're going to have to front it and get it later.
As for the segregation of costs, you're going to want to get one of us involved before the project starts or in the design phase, and we'll draw circles around what's eligible and what's not eligible, and then you're going to want your AIA pay apps, your schedule of values, to reflect the eligible costs from the ineligible costs. So it's already pre-programmed in what's going to happen when the project finishes, and eventually you get that check.
And to Jacob's point, we did it after on a large project in New York City. I went through 1,100 pages of AIAs. I never want to do that again.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is Francisco from Legacy. So just piggybacking on Tony's question, one of the strategies that we're doing is we're keeping the existing fossil fuel systems as, not for boosting, but climate reliability, right? Because the grid goes down, they can still utilize the steam system. So how does that play into the dual fuel use or the dual use scenario?
As an engineer, you'd have to prove out that your design is for that never to turn on except in emergency shutdown situations. And you'd want, as Pratt would want to have a letter from you on your letterhead stating that that's the case, and then we would call your loop fully eligible.
Yeah, and actually, maybe on the dual use point, just something. It's one of these. Dual use is one of those requirements that persists as long as you're within that investment tax credit recapture period, right? So if you have a change in the composition of energy, like during the operation during that 5 years of recapture, you can inadvertently trigger one of those clawback events. Now phases down to 20% per year, but it's one of those things. Dual use and kind of how much is brown power, green power, whatever else is one of the few things that apart from dispositions and casualty events, right, that could potentially cause recapture. So it's constant vigilance is recommended.
Good morning, Bob Wyman here. Jacob, in the comments that you filed on the proposed rules on January 22nd, 2024, you argued that the IRS was going beyond its authority by essentially making synonymous the word equipment with the word system, and that you felt that the unit of energy property rule should not apply at least to geothermal. It might apply to other things, but it certainly shouldn't apply to geothermal. You also argued that the improper regulations that were equating equipment and system also had a very significant impact on the 80-20 rule. I wonder, could you explain your interpretation of essentially the IRS's overstepping here, and what we should do about it? The most important thing is, what can we as an industry do, especially now that Chevron is no longer, to essentially fix this so that the IRS regulations do in fact reflect the law?
Yeah, so unfortunately it's always easiest to meet IRS regulation. So when IRS interprets something, the easiest thing to do is meet it. I think I agree with what I said then, is I think they've completely misinterpreted the law. The law says that what's eligible is equipment that uses the ground as a thermal energy source or as a thermal energy sink. It uses the word equipment. thermal storage, it uses the word system. But for ground source, it uses the word equipment. And so for the 80-20 rule, for owning the bore field and not owning heat pumps, all these, like even a retrofit where you just replace one heat pump out of 100 heat pumps in your building, I think that is a piece of equipment that uses the ground as a thermal energy source and a thermal energy sink. So what we need is maybe a small project, maybe a one heat pump project, retrofit, where now unfortunately you don't get audited automatically. It only happens 1 to 2% of the time. So you'd have to do this enough times that one of them gets audited, and then you win this in court. The only other way is pressure on Congress that puts pressure on the IRS, or just makes it very clear in a law change. But Congress doesn't act, they're not acting for Section 48 and writing a law for Section 48. It's got to be passed with a whole bunch of other laws. So it's going to be really hard to do it on that side of the coin. At the end of the day, it's going to be somebody brave enough to take the position with me, and we'll fight it all the way to court case, and we're going to win it because it's so clear. It's clear as day.
Yeah, I 100% agree with the insistence on the unit of energy property as being the envelope that we're concerned with for all these decisions seem to be at odds with the treatment of Section 48 property previously. Equipment, right? Not units of energy property, not functionally interdependent chains of equipment. But here we are. The regs say what they say. And you mentioned Chevron deference, right? That's so I think that it's a great point. How much do those Treasury regulations hold less weight now? And technically, I think they do, but I think practically, and I think this is where you were going, Jacob, is that it can make it really difficult. To even in advance of something like an audit, that 1 to 2% chance, doing things like binding tax insurance, right, or getting a tax equity investor. So I think that practically, if you're taking that position with the regulations as they're currently written, probably the best, as you go through various stakeholders in, for example, a monetization process, you might get some pushback, even though Chevron deference is a real is no longer there.
So Rick Clemenzi, Geothermal Design Center. Okay, snowmelt systems are not geothermal. They're boiler equivalent. But we're talking about doing a lot of design with buildings that are cooling dominant, and you want to be able to get rid of heat. You want to be able to get rid of heat the least expensive way, and the least expensive way can be very shallow loops under all the places that you can use them, like 4 days a year as a snow melt, but the rest of the time, especially during the spring, you're using them as a radiator, a shallow ground buried radiator. And so I don't know how to ask the question exactly, but in my mind, that's part of the geothermal system. It's an integral part of a system, if you're talking about system, that runs the thing and makes it work on an annual basis, and you're doing that in lieu of these other pieces of equipment and whatnot. So you're saving money, you're reducing the cost, and you're coming up with something that is ground buried, so it is a ground loop. And I just wanted to, get you guys to say what you think about that. I mean, in terms of going and challenging that, is that just the kind of thing you got to stake your foot out there and somebody's got enough guts to go with Jacob to court? Or how does it work?
All right, so just to frame this from a technical perspective, multifamily buildings, high-rise buildings are cooling dominant. So sometimes you do a dry cooler, sometimes you reject heat different ways. What Rick is saying is the heat would get rejected through the snow melt system. You could run it through those pipes, it could radiate the heat into the ground, but there's a few days a year that you could actually use it for what the named purpose is, which is snow melt, to melt the snow on those sidewalks.
Or maybe you take the name off too, like in the design, because that's not what it really is. It's sometimes you can use it for snow melt, but it really is a radiator, because you wouldn't put in snow melt otherwise. You're putting it in as a radiator that can be used as snow melt.
I guess just to clarify, that the original source of the heat is coming from a non-qualified system, and then it's waste heat from that cooling system that is getting pushed into the ground. Am I understanding that right?
Are you, Rick, are you saying that
Or is it geothermal for cooling and
it's
then?
all,
Oh, no, this is a geothermal system.
Okay.
It's just in a cooling dominant building, you've got extra heat on the year. Okay, you got to balance these systems. You got to get rid of that heat somehow. The smart way is to just lose it. One of the great examples is, for example, like IKEA store in Denver has this huge amount of radiant in the concrete, the loading docks. And now that's not in the ground, so I'm not going to claim that that would work. But I'm talking about an integral part of a geothermal system to get rid of that excess out of balance heat in the winter. So this is all about heating and cooling building.
Yeah, so I don't see a whole lot of concern. Now, it is going to be, if majority of the year its purpose is to heat and cool a portion of the structure, it can be qualified property. And there's going to be, if a portion of it is going to be a snow melt, I think there's conversations around whether you need to split out portions of the cost and kind of determine what portion of that is going to be eligible basis, because as Jacob was talking about earlier, a portion of it would fall under the incremental rules if it's considered snow melt. So there's some work to be done there just to figure out what portion of it's qualified, how it's qualified. But if it's sourced from a geothermal system, and even if it's kind of 2 steps away and it's waste heat from the system that you're repurposing, I would see there to be a pathway to get a portion of those costs.
and just want to toss out, just like from economics and dollars, across my projects, we're seeing this to be a fraction of a % of the total cost. So sometimes you say it's ineligible just to move along with life. And sometimes you weigh it out of like, what are your soft costs on, these guys' consultants fees and getting your engineers involved. You could spend $1 million writing something, but if you're going to get $10,000 of net proceeds to a project, does it really make sense?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of speak to the broader point, which is not every scenario is in the IRS guidance of how to handle it. So with all of these things, you're going to have these are all unique situations that we're all dealing with, and we don't know exactly, maybe the rules are a little fuzzy on exactly how we're going to handle a particular thing. With any situation, kind of like what Zachary's saying, you have to weigh the cost of like going after it and how much money we're going to spend to like make an argument to go after it. But in the end of the day, you're going to claim what you want to claim, and the IRS is going to audit it or they're not, right? So you do your best to come up with your best argument, and then you decide what your risk level is. Do you want to, am I real risky? Am I willing to take the risk, or am I risk averse and I don't want to mess with it? And then you claim it, you get the tax credit, and then you have to fight for it if they audit it, and you might lose it, and then you have to decide, was that worth the risk? So with all of these scenarios, you're always going to be dealing with that type of a scenario.
And maybe if I could just add one last bit to that. So as far as the technical analysis goes, you might want to start with Section 613 of the Internal Revenue Code, which is the definition of like the geothermal deposits, right? That are from which energy is sourced and that's credit eligible. And I think it's pretty broad, right? It's heat stored in rocks or aqueous vapor, underground, right? But I think it's probably prudent as part of that text analysis to understand the legislative history behind 613 and any sort of regulations that accompany that guidance, sub-regulatory guidance, that sort of thing. And I think from a tax technical perspective, that's the avenue that I would pursue to try to get confidence around a certain position related to something like that.
Larry Lessard, Achieve Renewable Energy. A realistic, but I'll call it a hypothetical example. Geothermal network with a client that wants to add wastewater heat recovery. So the question is, would that be dual use, resulting in the everything downstream of the loop being partially ineligible, and then if the wastewater heat recovery provides 50% or more, is everything then ineligible?
What wastewater?
So I guess the first part would be can we categorize it a different way? Can we call this thermal storage? The other thing is there's a little bit of a window with, they open the door in the regs with something called underground fluid. So if you're getting your waste stream from the building, then you're in trouble. But if you're getting it from a sewer system, maybe you can stand on the ground source side with underground fluid. So there's a possibility that if you can shift the energy use, you could be using thermal storage as an option. Alternatively, you could potentially be an underground fluid. What you're talking about here is all in the gray, and so it really comes down to what Josh was saying, your risk tolerance on taking these incentives. And yes, you would have to look at the energy sources to define whether it was eligible or ineligible for downstream items from it. And if it did rise to above 50% and it was determined that you were getting the energy from the building itself and you didn't meet the rules for thermal storage, you possibly would be unable to take the incentives for the distribution down the line.
So we're going to do just one more question. I know we could probably have an entire day session on this. So.
Yeah, Dylan Noon with the Bell Associates. Back to the wastewater heat recovery thing. If we were using a sewer system and a wet well, would that wet well qualify as thermal energy storage?
Well, I don't know that you'd have to use, when you say a wet well, is it groundwater? Is it?
No, it's pulling from the wastewater from a sewer system, combined sewer system.
But the sewer it's underground.
Correct.
Yeah, I think you don't have to use thermal storage. I think there's an opportunity. And once again, we're all talking about gray here because none of this is all spelled out in the legislation or spelled out in the regs. But I think there's a case for calling it ground source because they opened the door for underground fluid. And I don't know what, like they added the words underground fluid. So it's the ground, groundwater, or underground fluid. What other underground fluids are there? Maybe oil or something like that. But I don't know what else they were thinking about except potentially sewer systems.
Thank you.
So with that, I want to thank the panelists for coming and thanks everyone.
You guys were great. There was enough people out there. We could have went for another
Good.
hour. Looking at each individual scenario. Oh, yeah.
Just the residential federal tax credit went away.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was section 25D that I mentioned.
Yep. Like, could you quickly just take a look at this?
Yes. But now if you do third-party financing or, other things that way, you can get it.